Seeing all these seeing all these boxes, I am actually in my mind. I can actually remember the first time we were here, despite my youth. I want to say it was August 2008, if I remember correctly, 2009. And the only reason I remember that Sunday is because it was the first, or it was the start of boys' camp. And so instead of perhaps going up to meeting up there before the start of boys' camp, my dad wanted to be here for the first Sunday in the new place. And I just remember as a young child being somewhat anxious that I wasn't going to be up there to pick my bunk, and I was going to get stuck in the middle of some cot somewhere in the cabin. But anyway, only life's problems stayed that small. Thank you for allowing me to be here and share this morning. I appreciate the opportunity, and it is good to be here. Matthew 14 is where we could be turning. Matthew chapter 14 is the passage we'd like to focus on this morning. In the spring of 1995, a truck bomb would go off outside a federal building in Oklahoma City. 168 people, including 19 children, would perish that day. This was a tragic and devastating attack on America, certainly for the lives that were lost and the destruction that occurred, but also because this was an act of domestic terrorism. One of America's own citizens had carried out this attack. Bill Clinton was president at the time, and this was a defining moment of his presidency. He would give a speech several days after the attack occurred to a hall of thousands of mourners in Oklahoma City. One of his advisors would describe the account or the time, and he would say it was a room that was so eerily quiet, except for the sounds of sobbing. As President Clinton would be speaking, there would be a memorable part of his speech, a memorable part in which he would tell to those listening. He would say, "You have lost too much, but you have not lost everything. And you have certainly not lost America, for we will stand with you for as long as it takes." This was a defining moment of unity in his presidency. Just as September 11th was for George W. Bush, just as the Challenger disaster was for Ronald Reagan, just as the Kennedy assassination was for Lyndon Johnson. These are all moments when we think about them, that regardless of politics, everyone was looking to the president to meet the moment and to lead the nation out of tragedy. As President Clinton would speak that day to a hall of thousands of mourners, America was listening. In that moment, he would not be speaking to America, he would be speaking for America. We will stand with you for as long as it takes. That amidst difficulty, our nation always looks to our leader to guide and direct us in times of tragedy. In Matthew 14, as we will consider it this morning, we will see that it is a day that is very long and trying, a day of ministry for Jesus and his disciples. It is a day that would begin, as we'll see, with disheartening and sorrowful news. The life of someone close to Jesus, a member of his family, had died, their life taken from them. It was a day in which Jesus would gather his disciples together, and they would be together, and they would perhaps in their time together be grieving this news that they have heard. They would be maybe talking about and thinking about the implications of hearing that someone close to Jesus and close to his ministry had died, their life taken from them. It was a time when the disciples, no doubt, would look to their leader, Jesus, to guide them through this difficult time, a very busy time in the ministry of Jesus. We would see in chapter 14 that as the day would go on, their time together would be cut short, that the work and the demands of Jesus's ministry would continue on, and they wouldn't allow this news to cause interruption to that ministry. we would see in this chapter that there would be multitudes that would be following after Jesus. They too would be looking for him. They would be looking to him. They wanted to speak with him. They wanted to interact with him. They wanted to speak with him about their own difficulties. And we see in this chapter that Jesus would serve them. Quite literally, he would serve them a meal. And we would see that this day would go on. It would be a very long day for Jesus and his disciples. The day of ministry wasn't over yet. It was a day that would go late into the night. We read in this chapter that Jesus would then have time to be alone. This would be time that he would be praying and speaking with the Father. At the same time, he had sent the disciples out in a boat to cross the sea to the other side of the sea. And it would be late in the night. We read of the fourth watch, the early morning hours, that the disciples would find themselves in a perilous situation. And Jesus would go to them in that time. They would look to Jesus to come to them as they are in a very distressing situation and in need of rescue in the early morning hours. And so we will see in Matthew 14 that this is a very long day for Jesus and his disciples and his ministry. Jesus was always working. He was always caring for those around him. He was there to meet physical needs. He was there to meet emotional needs. He was there to meet spiritual needs. I would imagine this was a lot of work. This was a job for him that was very demanding. As we see in Matthew 14, many things were going on at this time. But we will see that Jesus, in this work, he never deviated from this work. It was who he was, and it was why he was here. And we could think that maybe just as a nation's citizens looks to its elected leader somewhat reflexively, somewhat naturally, to be a healer in chief in a time of tragedy. And I draw no equivalence here, but maybe as a picture for us, we can sense that the people around Jesus, that amidst difficulty, it's somewhat natural and it's comforting to look to somebody. Who is it that we should look to? We need someone to comfort us. We need someone to meet our needs. And it was so instinctive for those around Jesus to look to him. Certainly for his disciples, they were close to him. But we see that even in the multitudes, people who didn't even know Jesus. They didn't even necessarily know what he was about, but they're following after him. They want to speak with him. They want to talk with him. Those around him were always looking to him, and they were looking for him. They needed his help. They needed his guidance. They needed his comfort. And we see in Matthew 14 that throughout this day, this very long day, that Jesus was there for them. He showed up when they needed him. I don't have much in the way this morning of maybe practical application from these verses or even deep theological insight. But my hope is that as we just consider these verses, that we would just appreciate how Jesus cares for those around him, how he's there to meet needs, and he's always there for them when they need him. And so we find in the beginning of Matthew 14, we read of the details surrounding John the Baptist's death. We read in verse 4 that John had said to Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have her." And he is speaking of his brother's wife, Herodias. And we would find in verse 5 that because of that rebuke from John the Baptist, that Herod wanted to put John the Baptist to death. But out of fear for the multitude, he did not. He did not seek the death of John the Baptist. We read in Mark chapter 6, that Herod knew that John was a just and holy man. He knew about John. He knew him. He knew him to be a just and holy man. We find back in Matthew's account here that the sense that Herodias was angered too by this rebuke of John the Baptist to Herod. She too wanted John the Baptist bound up and killed. And we would find in verse 6 that there was this time, this opportune time that we read of, that it was Herod's birthday. being celebrated. The daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Therefore, he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. Mark's account would tell us that Herod offered to Herodias's daughter up to half of his kingdom. This was quite an offer he was making to her. And we read in verse 8 that Herodias's daughter was prompted by her mother, seeing that this was an opportune time. Give me John the Baptist's head here on a platter. And that's what would happen. John the Baptist would be beheaded. His head would be brought in a platter. It would be brought to Herodias. And so at this time, John the Baptist, his life being taken from him, we find in verse 12 that the disciples, John's disciples, would go and tell Jesus what had happened. They would tell him of John the Baptist's death. And then we also find in Matthew, they would tell him that Herod wanted to see Jesus. I wonder what was going through the mind of Jesus and of his disciples when they heard of this news. This certainly wasn't a surprise to Jesus. He's not surprised by anything. But this was an indication, certainly to his disciples, that the temperature of the environment that they were in was beginning to change. This was indication to them that there was increasing opposition to Jesus's ministry, that there was increasing hostility towards him and the work that he was doing. Hostility towards them was on the rise. We heard already, John the Baptist was viewed by Herod as a just and holy man. John was someone who was close to Jesus and close to his ministry. But yet here we find that Herod, a ruling authority, someone with authority, would seek that an innocent man be bound up and killed in this case. We find also at this time that there were a lot of comings and goings at the time for the disciples and at this time of Jesus' ministry. We sort of get the sense that the ministry was in full swing. Both Mark and Luke tell us that the disciples had just returned from a preaching mission at this time. And so Jesus is gathering them together. They've just returned. They're seeking time to be together. When we put the gospel together, it seems that they're also hearing of this news at this time too, that John the Baptist, his life was taken from him. Mark tells us that amidst all the hustle and bustle in their preaching mission, that they barely even had time to eat. So it was very busy. So Jesus is seeking time for them to be together, to share a meal and to rest. And so he seeks out a private place for them to do that, a deserted place. Perhaps this was a time for them to be together, certainly. This was a time to maybe process all that was going on, a time for them to talk about everything that was going on. I wonder, and I sort of imagine this time that they're together was a time for the disciples maybe to look to Jesus for encouragement and to look to him for strength amidst very difficult and demanding work that they were in full swing of by this point. This work was demanding. It was challenging. With this news of John the Baptist's death, it was becoming more challenging. It was more hostile towards them and the work that they were doing. This was a hostile environment, given the news they've just heard. And I just picture them as they're in this room. I can't imagine how refreshing it must have been for them to see Jesus, to be there with him, and to talk with him after they had been away. And perhaps even for ourselves, when we're feeling tired, when we're feeling discouraged or weary, we could think of the people in our lives we long to be with and we long to speak to in those moments, the people we look to for encouragement, godly encouragement, people to talk to about the difficulties of life, a close circle, your family and your close friends. When I picture this scene, that's what I picture. I would imagine that this was that type of time. that amidst the difficulties of ministry and travel and sad news, that this was a time for them to be together and to recharge with Jesus before they would go out and do it all again. Jesus sought time for those he was closest to. He made it a priority because he knew it was important. And the encouragement and sort of the challenge, even for me, as I thought about these verses, that we may seek to do that for one another, just as Jesus did that for his disciples. That most of all we may seek to do that for one another, and most of all may we seek that same type of time with Jesus, just as the disciples did. And so we would find in verse 13 that as the disciples were with Jesus, they were together, that there was this multitude that were following after them on foot from the cities, verse 13. Mark would tell us, and we read here also, that they were coming from all different cities. They wanted to see Jesus, and they were just coming from all these places to sort of chase after him. They wanted to see him. They wanted to speak with him and talk to him. Mark tells us in his account that even before they arrived at the place they were going, that people were so eager to see Jesus, they beat him there. They beat him seemingly to this destination that they were going. And as we read on in these verses, we see that Jesus makes himself available to those who wanted to see him and those who wanted to discover Jesus and see what he was about, and those who were looking for him. We have just thought that he did that privately. He made time for his disciples privately when they were together. And we see here that Jesus does that publicly also, as evidenced by this scene. That even as this would somewhat disrupt the time that Jesus had set aside for his disciples, for them to be together after they had been gone, that Jesus sees the people coming, he sees the multitudes coming, and he's moved with compassion for them. Verse 14, he sees the great multitude, and he was moved with compassion for them and healed their sick. This sense that he wasn't in a rush. He was not eager to send them away so that he could return back to the time with the disciples. He takes the time to be with them. He takes the time to receive them, to speak with them, Luke tells us, to heal the sick. That's what we've read in Matthew. Mark would say that they were like sheep without a shepherd. And we could picture this scene where Jesus is taking time to be their shepherd. That even as he sought time to be alone with the disciples, time to eat with them, time to be with them, he didn't turn away the multitudes who were running after him to see him, but rather he began to serve them. That this private ministry and the public ministry of Jesus was very much the same. He cared for, he served, and he loved those who were around him, whether they were his close circle, the disciples, or the multitudes. He loved them. He cared for them. He wanted to be among them and to serve them. It was not a burden for Jesus. It was not an inconvenience. It was something that he desired to do, and he made time for it. It was important to him. And so we are now in this scene, the feeding of the 5,000. It's getting late. The disciples are becoming concerned. It's maybe getting dark out. The night is approaching. It's already been a long day, I would imagine. There are people here, and the disciples say that verse 15, this is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food. The disciples go to Jesus and they kind of say, we need to wrap this up. It's getting late. These people have not brought food with them. We better get them on their way so that they can go into the villages and get food. Interesting, even from that point there, the sense that the multitudes were so eager to see Jesus, they're so eager to run after him and meet him, that they set out on this journey by foot and they don't even pack food for the journey. So here they are in a deserted place, and food is an issue, and the disciples are thinking that the multitudes need to to get back into the villages and buy food. Jesus tells his disciples in response that they would take care of the food problem. Jesus tells them, verse 16, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. Jesus is telling his disciples that you, the disciples, get them something to eat. Max Lucado would tell this story of a 12-year-old boy whose summer job it was to pull and dig stumps out of the ground, and then the wood would be used for kindling. There was one occasion in this story he would tell that a particular stump was giving this young boy a lot of grief. This was a stump that he had worked at all day and sort of working to dig it out of the ground. And he could just imagine a scene that any tool that was at his disposal, he'd just take it and was just metaphorically or maybe even literally throwing it at the stump in order to get this stump out of the ground. He pushed and he pulled at the stump, but yet he just wasn't making any progress. And so the day would come to an end, and his dad would return that evening to pick up his son. He would stand back for a moment and he would just watch his son as he was working. And finally, the father would speak up and he'd say, I think I see what your problem is. I sort of wonder as the son to be like, please tell me, I've worked at this all day. What am I missing? Why is this so problematic for me? And the father would say, you are not using all of your strength. This caused the young boy to erupt. What do you mean I'm not using all my strength? I've been working at this stump all day long. I've quite literally used all of my strength to get this stump out of the ground, and I'm still not successful. And the father would respond to the son, and he would say, you have not asked me to help you. Father is saying, I am part of your resources. Here I am. I can help you. Allow me to use my strength to help you to finish the job. And so that came to my mind as I thought about this scene with the feeding of the 5,000. This scene where Jesus tells the disciples, you get them something to eat. And it's this scene where Jesus doesn't jump right in and start multiplying loaves and fish. But rather we see this scene play out. And he allows the disciples to go out and search for the loaves and the fish and see how much food was out there. And we know what they come back with. This was a scene in another gospel account that the disciples would suggest that perhaps they have money. Maybe they should cater the meal for the people. And they would quickly realize they didn't quite have enough funds to do so. So that was off the table. And after they sort of worked through those things, they came up with some ideas. They went out and they searched for food. We see that Jesus comes in now and he shows them the depth of his resources, and he does a miraculous work. And this is a scene where he not only feeds the 5,000, he certainly does that, but he also strengthens the belief of the disciples to show them what he was capable of, to remind them that they could and they should always look to him, look for him, look for his help. He was there to help them. He wanted to help them. And that's what he did in this case, as he said, you shall go get them something to eat and allow me to help you do that. So this is a day that is quickly coming to a close. The night is coming. The people have now been fed. Verse 22. Immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he sent the multitudes away. So dinner had been wrapped up. And we find in this scene that the multitudes had been sent away, and Jesus goes up on a mountain by himself to pray, and he was alone there. And we find at this scene, Jesus is up on a mountain by himself. He's alone. He's with the Father. And down at the sea level, that the disciples were in a boat and they were crossing the sea. And the wind begins to become contrary. We read the wind is coming against them. The waves begin to build, and very quickly we see this scene where the apostles are now rowing for their lives. This was a hard day already. been through so much, a day of serving, a day of ministry. I'm sure they were tired, but the day was not over yet. As they tried to get to the other side, it's windy, it's wet, and it's dark. And they are struggling now to move forward in the boat. And we would find that as we read that it is in the fourth watch of the night, verse 25, that Jesus would come to them. The fourth watch, the very early morning hours, that Jesus goes to them in this moment that they are afraid and in their moment of need. He comes to them walking on the water. And we find here, verse 26, that they were troubled by what they saw. They didn't quite understand what was coming towards them. And so they suggest that it is a ghost. They were so tired, perhaps they were so weary in the day that was before them, that this is a moment where they see something and they suggest that it's a ghost. What is that out there on the sea? It is a ghost. I'm not sure what I would think if I saw someone walking on water coming towards me, so maybe I won't blame them for that suggestion. But nonetheless, Jesus, upon hearing this, he says, "Be of good cheer. It is I. Do not be afraid." After they had just cried out for fear. And so we find that of the disciples in the boat, Peter being one of them, that Jesus is telling Peter, a career fisherman, someone who knew wind and waves pretty well. He had experienced plenty in his day, I'm sure. And he's telling Peter, do not be afraid. And I sort of wonder here that I suspect maybe that says less about Peter and more so about the severity of the storm. This was a violent storm. They had reason to be fearful. They had reason to be scared. They had reason to lose hope. They had reason to fear, perhaps, that maybe they wouldn't make it out of this scene alive. And so the disciples still aren't quite sure who it is. Peter would say, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And we would find that that's what he does. Peter begins to walk on water towards Jesus. These turbulent and these tumultuous, stormy waters, and now Peter is walking on them. We find in this scene that we don't read that he stopped to grab anything. He doesn't pause to think about what he's doing. By indication, he just starts walking, and he starts walking out onto the water towards Jesus. He believed that God had the power to allow him to walk on water. And so that's what he does. He walks on the water. This is not a story that's meant for entertainment. I mean, we don't walk on water. That isn't something we've ever seen. That's not something we would be accustomed to. This isn't meant for entertainment. This was not a miracle done to impress the disciples. Let me show you, things I can do. Isn't this cool? Peter can walk on water. This wasn't a moment for Peter to do something special, to do something that no human could ever do of their own accord. This was a miracle that demonstrated Jesus's power, that demonstrated the depth of his resource, to demonstrate what he could do. And this was also a moment that we see the faith of Peter. That before Peter fell into the water, and sometimes that's maybe our focus of this portion, Peter fell into the water. Before he fell into the water, we could remember where he was when he fell. He had left the boat. He was walking on water. He had faith that allowed him to do that. He believed that God would allow him to walk on the water. And maybe even for our own example here, let us learn to have faith like Peter did in this moment, to step out onto the water with nothing but our faith. And so we would find here that that's what Peter does. I read somewhere once that our fear of doing things comes less from the thought of actually doing them and more so from the thought of doing them alone, from having to do something on our own. There is great comfort in having people by our side when we need to do something difficult. And we could picture in this scene here that as Peter has stepped out onto the water and as he's walking on the water, as he would take a step of faith, that Jesus was right there for him. He was right there. Peter, come to me. And that's what Peter would do. But we do read also that there was a moment when Peter would take his eyes off of Jesus. Maybe a moment when he was frightened by what he's just entered. And we see this moment where he begins to sink, that all that's around him begins to consume him. It's a moment when Peter's doubts begin to creep in. He's being swallowed up. He's beginning to sink to the bottom. And perhaps even as we think about this parable, that now it's a parable that seems very relatable. We can begin to see ourselves in this parable or this story. That Peter was undoubtedly very close to Jesus. He was in his inner circle. This was a moment when Jesus was directly in front of him. He was coaching him to come towards him. And perhaps here that even as we could certainly note that Peter stumbled and fell into the water, that this was part of his development. This was part of his time to learn how to walk, to learn how to trust Jesus, to learn that Jesus was right there for him. He was right there as he took that step of faith out onto the water. He was learning how to trust Jesus in very turbulent and very tumultuous waters. He was learning that he could trust Jesus in those moments. And we find in this story that Jesus demonstrates that to Peter as he stretches out to grab Peter by the hand as he is falling into the water, as he then brings him back to the boat. What can we say about Peter, and maybe even as we see ourselves in this story, what can we say of this moment? Peter had enough faith to step out onto the water and start walking towards Jesus. And he had no reason to doubt. He had no reason to be uncertain. Jesus was right there as he was walking. He's standing right in front of him. Jesus had given him the power to walk on the water. But yet he was still uncertain. He still had a moment of doubt. And he still faltered and he still stumbled into the water. And we could sit here and talk all day about Peter and this scene. But this is also a scene that, as much as it tells us about Peter, it tells us more about Jesus. That in moments of stumbling, Jesus is stretching out his hand. Jesus didn't tell Peter, he didn't stand back from afar. Well, Peter, if you just get up, I'll give you another chance. Go ahead and try that again and see if you can walk towards me on the water without falling. Don't let your faith fail you this time. That's not what Jesus said. In fact, Jesus didn't say anything. He simply grabbed Peter by the hand and he brings him back to the boat. Jesus proves to Peter that he could look to him when he stumbled and fallen. And he proves to Peter that he would be there to help him get up. I think President Clinton's speech that he gave in the days following the Oklahoma City bombing was an excellent speech. The tone was right. He said what people needed to hear. He delivers it well. Politics aside, he truly met the moment that needed to be met as he stood there and spoke. I enjoy reading about and learning about those moments in history. I think they're inspiring. They're historical moments, and people remember them as such. moments when people meet the moment, they rise to the occasion, they say what needs to be said, and all these things. For every president, there's a handful of moments from their presidency that are like this, and everyone feels like a proud American. But we also we know our leaders. We know we're usually disappointed in them. Usually we feel like they don't meet the moment, as evidenced by 20% approval ratings everywhere. And perhaps even as we think about that, as we call them out, maybe we could call ourselves out. How often do we not feel like maybe we're doing the best job that we could, rising to the occasion, always striving to be Christ-like in our interactions with everybody, being sensitive to one another in both word and deed. We know how often we fall short. Also, we are fallen and broken people. We will continue to stumble and fall. That's part of our broken nature. But as we've considered Matthew 14, may our focus and may we find encouragement that even as we consider one day in the life of Jesus, that he was always meeting the moment. We will fail over and over and over again. We will fail one another. We'll stumble and fall. We'll say stuff that we don't mean. We'll lash out for no reason. But we find that when we look at Jesus, he is always there to comfort and to guide, to heal, and to direct. I'm reminded of a line from the first verse of Abide With Me, which would say, "When other helpers fail and comforts flee, help of the helpless, abide with me." What a beautiful and glorious thought that is. That if nothing else from this morning, I hope we might just enjoy the thought that Jesus will be there to meet our every need, that we need never lose hope in him, that he doesn't just rise to the occasion when it's convenient for him or when it's politically advantageous. He is always meeting the moment and meeting our needs. And I hope we have been able to see that this morning from Matthew 14. Father, we thank you for this day and this season, that we could remember your Son, the Lord Jesus, that we could know of his love and his care towards us, love that would bring him down to this earth and take him to the cross. We just thank you for this scene in Matthew 14 that we could think of this morning, that he was always there to comfort and to guide and direct and to heal those around him. And we think that that was not true even for the people, not only for the people that were there in that scene, but that's true for us also, that your Son is always by our side to guide and direct us through life and all that we need. We just thank you for that encouragement. We just pray for the week ahead, time when we enter the new year. We just pray that you would bless each one of us as we enter this new year. We just pray all of this in the name of the Lord Jesus. Amen.